This podcast does not provide medical advice. Please listen to the complete disclosure at the end of the recording.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Everyone Dies, the podcast where we talk about serious illness, dying, death, and bereavement. I'm Marianne Matzo, a nurse practitioner, and I use my 43 years of nursing experience to help you understand what happens at the end of life.
And I'm Charlie Navarrete, an actor in New York City, here to ask the questions that you may have while listening to our podcast. We are both here because we believe that the more you know, the better prepared you are to make difficult decisions.
So please relax, get yourself a beverage, something to eat, maybe a nice bagel, some cream cheese, and lox.
Well, the lox, yes, of course, yes.
And thank you for spending the next hour with Charlie and me. In the first half, we have our recipe of the week from Charlie and a new series about cemeteries brought to us by our CEO, David. In the second half, we're going to be talking about everything you always wanted to know about autopsies, but were afraid to ask. And in the third half, Charlie reports about spirit photography. So Charlie, what's our recipe this week?
Today's recipe: a modern type of pemmican is tied up with fur trade and the near extinction of the American buffalo at the hand of humans. To quote Agent Smith from The Matrix speaking to Morpheus, "I'd like to share a revelation that I've had during my time here. It came to me when I tried to classify your species, and I realized that you're not actually mammals. Every mammal on this planet instinctively develops a natural equilibrium with the surrounding environment. But you humans do not. You move to an area and you multiply and multiply until every natural resource is consumed, and the only way you can survive is to spread to another area. There is another organism on this planet that follows the same pattern. Do you know what it is? A virus. Human beings are a disease, a cancer on this planet. You are a plague, and we are the cure."
Whoa.
How fitting for these times. You know, it's like, holy smoke. And when did The Matrix come out? What, 20-something years ago?
I don't know. It's been a while, though.
Yeah. No, more than 20 years ago, the first one. Yeah, it's, it's like, I think like 25 years. Well, whatever it is, you can look it up, folks. But yeah, it's been around a long time. And for this, yes, I always do my homework and my research. Wow, yeah, it's nuts. Yeah.
So what does that have to do with food?
Well, pemmican was invented by the native peoples of North America and is a concentrated mixture of fat and protein used as a nutritious food. Historically, it was an important part of Native American cuisine in certain parts of North America, and actually is still prepared today. The word comes from the Cree word pemmican, which itself is derived from the word pemmi, which means fat or grease. The Lakota or Sioux word is wasna, with the wa meaning anything and the sna meaning ground up. So, ground up beef. Ground up beef, ground up buffalo meat. Exactly, yeah. Basic pemmican can be made by cutting lean wild meat or beef thin, drying it along with some blueberries, processing it into a powder and mixing with rendered fat to make a congealed ball. American pioneers added all kinds of different berries and nuts to their pemmican to jazz it up. A fabled Iowa pioneer matriarch, Grandma Clemmy Noller, laced her pemmican with popcorn, molasses, sweet corn, peanuts, butter, bacon grease, bacon bits, fried pork rinds, raisins, and any berry that was in season. How about that?
That was probably like the first granola bar.
Oh, yes. Except that now every berry is in season. Yes. Our recipe is a hot version of pemmican, which comes from a high school friend of Marianne's that accidentally texted it to her. She asked him about it, and he said it was a traditional Michigan Indian dish that would be served at funerals and festivals. Thank you, John and Kathy, for permission to share this with our listeners. Next, making his debut, our CEO, David Gillette, is starting a first-half series about fascinating cemeteries. Some he has visited and some he wants to. David?
By far, one of the most interesting cemeteries I've visited is Gettysburg. It's located in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and most of you know that it was the site of a famous Civil War battle. Gettysburg is a national memorial site and the final resting place of 3,500 Union soldiers. In June of 1863, the Confederate Army, under the command of General Robert E. Lee, pushed into Union territory. For 3 days, 150,000 soldiers attacked Union forces in a series of battles at Gettysburg. In those 3 days, 10,000 soldiers were killed, 30,000 injured, and 10,000 captured or missing. Only Union soldiers are buried at Gettysburg. The cemetery was dedicated in November of 1863, and President Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg address during the ceremony. The Gettysburg area is full of peaceful, wooded countryside. The peace contrasts with the horror that took place there. As I walked the ground at Gettysburg, it was hard to wrap my head around the brutality and heroism that was on display during the battle. The final battle, called Pickett's Charge after the Confederate general that led the charge, 12,500 Confederate soldiers charged over 100 yards of open field as they attacked the Union forces. Half of them were killed during the charge. The soldiers were said to have put notes in their clothes so that their bodies could be identified later. The Confederate Army was defeated after the battle and had to retreat south. I came away from Gettysburg with respect, sadness, and humility. I had respect for the heroism of soldiers on both sides. I was saddened by the loss of life and injury that fellow Americans inflicted on one another. And I was humbled that as a military leader, I had the responsibility to the nation and to my troops, which was weighty indeed. If you have a chance to visit the National Memorial, it's well worth the trip. It's easy to drive from Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and we'll include links in our resources section on the website if you care to visit.
That's great, David. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David. It's great to hear you on the air. And please go to our webpage for the pemmican recipe and additional resources for this program. We hope you will follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and kindly remember to rate and review this podcast. As a licensed nonprofit organization, we are dependent on our wonderful listeners and newcomers, and always appreciate your donations, which, by the way, are tax deductible. Please go to our webpage to donate in support of our work at www.everyonedies.org. That's dies.org. Marianne?
Thanks, Charlie. So in our second half, I'm going to be talking with you about autopsies. And in the case of if the death is sudden and it's unexpected, or if it occurs at home, usually the medical examiner is going to be notified, and he or she is going to decide if an autopsy is required. The family has no authority to stop an officially mandated autopsy. Now, the rules are different in every state. I've worked in hospice in New Hampshire, and if it was an expected death with hospice involved, the nurse that was there could pronounce the person dead, sign the death certificate, and the funeral home could come and pick up the body. When I was in Michigan, when my mom died, she had hospice support, but the rule in Michigan was the police had to come. So we had to wait for the police to show up. The police, I'm not sure, I guess they were looking to see if there was any foul play, but the person was in hospice. I don't know what foul play there would have been. But anyway, the police had to sign off before the undertaker could come and pick up her body. So every state is different. Just ask your hospice nurse what what is going to happen in your case. Now, the next of kin can request an autopsy even if a medical examiner decides not to do one. An autopsy is going to determine the cause of death, but if it's not required by the medical examiner, you're going to have to pay for it. Autopsies are not covered under Medicare, Medicaid, or most insurance plans, though some hospitals, particularly teaching hospitals, do not charge for autopsies of individuals who died in their hospital. A private autopsy by an outside expert can cost between $3,000 and $5,000. In some cases, there may be an additional charge for the transportation of the body to and from the autopsy facilities. Now, autopsies are best performed within 24 hours of death, before organs deteriorate, and ideally before embalming, which can interfere with the toxicology and blood cultures. But autopsies performed on decomposed or even exhumed bodies can still provide vital information, depending on the extent of the decomposition. An autopsy will generally take 2 or 3 hours to complete, except if there are excessive complications. Now, autopsies serve a lot of other purposes. So let me tell you about some of them. They can discover or clarify new diseases. They can explain unknown or unanticipated medical complications. They can assist in the development or the quality assurance of new technology. So if like a new surgical procedure was done, the autopsy can see, did that contribute to whatever was the cause of death? It can educate medical students and can provide physician continuing education. Now, they can also classify and explain sudden or unexpected or unnatural deaths. So let's say if there was suddenly a wave of the same kind of deaths happening and it's like, ooh, what's going on here? The autopsy might be able to shed some light on that. They can identify infectious or contagious diseases, identify and monitor occupational or environmental health hazards. They can act as quality control and risk assessment for hospital practices. They can provide a source of organs and tissues for medical and scientific purposes, meaning that they might, if they're developing a drug or developing, a chemotherapy kind of thing, they can, if that person's been on it, they can take samples of that tissue and look at it and do research on it in terms of what the drug did to the body, or they can use those tissues to actually experiment on human tissue what the effect these drugs may have. They provide materials and hypotheses for research. So if you say, well, I think that Diet Coke is going to do this to the kidneys, and so you develop a research plan, then if you got that tissue from, with permission of the family, kidney tissue, you could do your experiment. Improve accuracy and usefulness of vital procedures. They can help in the grief process in that if that autopsy is going to give information about a disease, let's say Alzheimer's disease, and it might be good for the family to think, well, we don't have the science that can help the person that I love now, because they've died, but maybe there's something they're going to find in his or her brain that will lead them to a cure. And so that gives some meaning to that death. It, in the same way, provides a vehicle for contributions. Like I've died of this disease, but maybe they're doing this complete autopsy is going to help them figure this out. It can discover contagious diseases within the family and assist in genetic counseling and identification of family health risks, and provide information in terms of insurance and death benefits. If they can show on an autopsy that the cause of death was related to Agent Orange or something like that, then that'll help with death benefits. So, the word autopsy comes from the Greek autopsia, which means seeing with one's own eyes. Pathologists, who are physicians who have specialized in human anatomy, perform them. Organs are removed and inspected, and the body fluids are analyzed. There are 3 degrees of autopsy. There's a complete autopsy, a limited, and a selective. A complete autopsy exposes all body cavities, including the head, for examination. Limited autopsy usually excludes the head, and selected autopsy involves examination of only one or more organs specific to the nature of the illness. So if you had stomach cancer and you are paying for that autopsy yourself, you can say, well, I just want you to look at the stomach and tell me what was going on there. If the person who died has requested that his or her organs be donated, the nurse, after the person died, is often the person who's responsible for notifying the proper agencies for organ and tissue harvesting. Organ donation is the practice of giving a part of the deceased body for transplantation into another person. Persons designate this wish to donate organs by signing the back of their driver's license, indicating their preferences, by specifying organ donation in an advance directive, or filling out an organ donor card. We did a podcast about this, so listen to that podcast about organ donation for more information, and we'll have that in the links. Depending on what organ is being donated, the time for organ removal varies. Eyes must be removed within 4 hours of the death, but once they're in a preservative, they can wait 10 to 14 days to be transplanted. Tissue like bones, skin, and tendons can wait 12 to 24 hours to be removed from the deceased and can be preserved, depending on the method of preservation, for 3 to 5 years. If the body has been refrigerated within 4 hours of death, the saphenous veins can be harvested in the following 10 hours and heart valves within 24 hours. So an autopsy starts with the big picture and ends up with a microscopic evaluation. So the first thing that pathologist is going to do is look at the outer appearance, including clothes, accessories. And as I was working on this explanation, I thought, I don't know, do I even have to go through this? Because we've watched enough crime shows where we can see that different people, we've seen them do autopsies or talk through autopsies.
Yep.
But for those of you who, aren't into crime shows, I'll go through it. So they note the weight, the height, the eye color, the hair color, the texture, the length, ethnicity, sex, and the approximate age of the body. This information can help provide evidence as well as give clues as to the identity of the body if it has not been positively identified. The next step is part of an external examination, but it consists of having a closer look at the body itself. All the clothes are taken off, and it is fully exposed, and the skin is carefully examined. Some of the things that a pathologist is looking for is gunpowder residue, flakes of skin or paint, injuries, or any evidence that could be used to determine what caused the death. They will look at scars, tattoos, or any identifying marks. So the next part is x-rays. And x-rays can be used to assess whether there are any bone abnormalities or foreign objects in the body. And ultraviolet light can be used to detect specific residues. This is the part of the procedure where hair or nail samples may be taken for further examination. Next is the internal examination, and this includes examining the chest and the abdominal cavities as well as the brain. This is done by making careful incisions. The chest and the abdomen are assessed through a Y or U incision, which starts at the shoulder, then meets at the sternum, sternum, and finally reach the pubic bone. The brain is reached by making an incision from ear to ear on the back of the skull, or by a triangular incision across the top of the skull. These incisions bleed minimally because the heart is no longer pumping blood. Before making the incisions, the torso is placed on a rubber block in a way that stretches out the body for maximum exposure during the exam. After performing the Y or the U incision, the pathologist first examines all of the organs in place by removing the frontal part of the rib cage. So they take off the front part of the rib cage and they look at where everything is in the body. And then they start to remove the major organs, including the heart, the lungs, the liver, the stomach, and the spleen. The organs are then weighed to detect the presence of certain illnesses. Blood samples are also taken for further investigation, and small pieces of tissue from each organ is examined under a microscope. The contents of the stomach are then examined, and this is a good indicator of time of death, the last meal, as well as the level of digestion, and can be seen and used to determine a time frame. Then they're going to test the body fluids for anything from drugs to chemicals to genetic composition, infection, depending on the type of autopsy in terms of what they're going to look for. Some of these fluids include urine, blood, bile, eye fluid. Some poisons will only be observable in some parts of the body, but not in others, so they're going to be looking around. The organs are then placed back in the body or preserved for teaching or research purposes. If there's a brain examination, the pathologist will then typically move on to the head area. Another more concentrated external examination will take place to determine whether there are signs of head injury. Then an incision is made, and just like the other organs, the brain is first examined inside the body, then removed to be examined further. Tissue samples are also taken. Some of the other organs, but especially the brain, are often placed in formalin for a few days before a dissection takes place. This is done to allow the organs to become firmer, which increases the ease and the precision of that dissection. If the pathologist finds anything unusual in any of those acquired tissues, then those tissues are going to be preserved. Once all the organs have been thoroughly examined or either put back or been preserved, the body is stitched back up. The breastbone and the ribs are also returned to their original positions. Before the organs are returned, they are placed in bags to prevent leakage, and the inside of the body is lined with this wool-like substance. This procedure does not disturb an open casket funeral, as none of the incisions will be visible after the burial preparations have been made. It's important to note that each autopsy is going to be unique depending on the purpose of the procedure. At the end of the procedure, an in-depth report is written. The report contains all the observations made during the procedure, as well as explanations of any of the findings and the results. It also gives a medical diagnosis and a detailed summary of the case, explaining how conclusions were drawn. Now, I know that was a detailed explanation, but a lot of us don't have the chance to see an autopsy or to know what happens, and so I thought it would be a good idea to just run through that. Do you have any questions, Charlie?
I'm sorry, I don't remember. Did you mention when somebody has died and their organs will be donated, that they will be they can be hooked up to a breathing machine, and basically, the person is clinically dead, but the purpose of being hooked up to the machine is, basically to keep the organs alive until they can be removed. I don't remember. Did you mention that?
No, I didn't talk about that, but we did talk about that when we talked about organ donation.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So I kind of took it from the point of the person has died. And even though the person has died, for some parts of the body, they can still harvest those
Right.
after they're dead. The reason that they have to stay on a bypass machine that or ventilator, whatever they need, is because the heart and the lungs and certain organs have to be living organs
Right.
when they're harvested and sent to the donor body. So that's a different situation than those that can be taken, in this case, during an autopsy.
You'd also mentioned, how did you put it? That just so that the professionals performing the autopsy can determine the cause of death, and with that, you gave an example of the way they find out how people die is, for example, maybe they will introduce, and I don't remember exactly how you put it, but maybe like introduce Coca-Cola to an organ or something like that, and then they'll see how an organ reacts to Coca-Cola, and so they will do this with multiple liquids, multiple foods to see, and so how was it?
What I was talking about there is that the tissues can be used for other research. So you might need, it wasn't a great example, but my example was, let's say you wanted to know, your question was, what's the effect of Diet Coke on kidney tissue?
Ah, okay.
So you would, have your research study all set up. You would have requested particular samples from whatever part of the kidney that you think that it's going to have an effect on. It's a really bad example because that's not how they would do it. But you get the big picture of, if you had a study with an hypothesis that had been approved for use with human tissue, but you weren't going to be doing that, it's not ready for prime time, meaning it's not ready to go to living, actual people walking around,
right.
that you can request either cells or they're called tissue cones or tissue blocks with which that you can do your research. So that was just an example of using tissue that's harvested during an autopsy for the purposes of resurgery. And that's only done. That's only done with permission of the family,
from the, right? Yeah.
Or permission from the patient, because there are some cultural groups that the body has to be completely intact with everything in order to be buried.
Yeah.
And so those groups are not going to say, "Oh, it's okay, take some tissue blocks and this kind of thing to do your research," because then the body's not considered intact anymore. So this is more to give you the idea that there's a lot of things that can go on in an autopsy. There's a lot of use for the tissues that are in our bodies if we're willing to donate them to science so that they can do experiments on human tissue.
Right.
Does that make better sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah, that's what I was checking. I didn't quite get what you were saying, but no, it's very clear now. Thanks.
Well, that's why we pay you the big bucks, Charles.
Yes, exactly.
To ask the questions, the inquiring questions that if everyone was sitting right here with me, they would be asking me.
Yes.
It's a heavy load, isn't it, Charles? That just really hit you, what you're really doing here.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow, man.
Wow.
Wow. So you're going to be talking about spirit photography. So what is that for our third half?
around the time of the Civil War, spiritualism appeared, a movement based on the belief that the spirits of the dead exist and have both the ability and the inclination to communicate with the living. Spiritualism flourished, but by the late 1880s, the credibility of the movement had weakened due to accusations of fraud perpetrated by mediums and spirit photography. Now, spirit photography, also called ghost photography, is a type of photography whose primary goal is to capture images of ghosts and other spiritual entities. The spiritualism movement contributed greatly to the popularity of spirit photography. Photographers such as William Mumler and William Hope ran thriving businesses taking photos of people with their supposed dead relatives. Both were shown to be frauds, while true believers such as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, refused to accept the evidence as proof of a hoax.
Isn't that just weird?
I know. And listen, Conan Doyle actually wrote a book, supporting the idea that, yes, these photographers are actually capturing pictures of these, of the dead. I mean, he just believed this wholeheartedly. And even when everything was discovered to be a fraud, not for him. No, it was not a fraud.
Did Sherlock Holmes come out of the book and slap him upside the head?
Well, or at least he should have investigated something. Something. I'm going to see if I can contact Benedict Cumberbatch and see what Mr. Cumberbatch would have to say about this.
Yes, I'd like to talk to him myself.
Until then, spirit photography started when photographers noted that long exposures would often result in transparent images when people or animals left the frame during the exposure. In 1856, it was recognized that these effects could be used to deliberately create ghostly pictures. Now, I mentioned William H. Mumler. He was a jewelry engraver in Boston, and he practiced amateur photography. In the early 1860s, he developed a self-portrait that appeared to feature the apparition of his cousin who had been dead for 12 years. This is widely considered to be the first spirit photograph. And again, a photograph of a living subject featuring the likeness of a deceased person, usually a relative, imprinted by the spirit of the deceased. Exactly. Submitted for your approval. I miss the Twilight Zone, the original Twilight Zone.
I know. God, that was good.
Mumler became a full-time spirit photographer because, well, let's face it, there were a lot of Benjamins to be made. He continued to work in Boston, but eventually moved to New York City. We're not sure if it was a voluntary move because people were starting to catch on in Boston. But yeah, he left Beantown and moved to the Big Apple, where his work was analyzed by numerous photography experts, none of whom could find any evidence of fraud. Spirit photography was a lucrative business thanks to the enormous death tolls that resulted from the Civil War and the thousands of families who sought reassurance that their loved ones, well, basically lived on after death. The Lincolns, President Lincoln and his wife, their 11-year-old son Willie died unexpectedly of typhoid during the first year of the Civil War. Young Willie was taken to Oak Hill Cemetery, where he was interred in a marble crypt. On at least 2 occasions, and this was verified by contemporary newspapers, the president visited the crypt at night, where he sat over the body of his son and mourned. Some accounts say the president opened the coffin to hold Willie. Of course, Mr. Lincoln was assassinated at the end of the war, and Mumler's his most famous photograph shows Mary Todd Lincoln posed with the purported spirit of her assassinated husband. Though it was never really made clear if Mrs. Lincoln took this picture seriously or she just simply found solace in the image.
That image also has her son in it. Lincoln's like standing behind her with
And
his
then
hand,
Willie.
and then Willie's on her
Yeah.
right. So that was like a double whammy for Mumler.
Crazy. Critics of Mumler's work included P.T. Barnum, who had his own issues with authenticity. Yeah, thank you.
There's a sucker born every minute.
There you are. Wait, was that him or?
Yeah, that was him.
That was him. That was him. What am I thinking? No, there was a newspaper reporter who, the great newspaper man out of Baltimore. Of course, whose name I forgot. But basically said no one ever went broke underestimating the taste of the American public. Oh, shoot. What is his name? Oh, well. Anyway.
Maybe that's why we're broke, because we think that they're smart.
Yeah, there we are. Yep.
Yeah.
So
there we go.
Barnum claimed that Mumler was taking advantage of people whose judgment was clouded by grief. Yeah, no kidding. Barnum's accusation was one of many that accused Mumler of staging ghosts of people who were still alive. According to writer Joe Nickell, Mumler was exposed as a fraud when people recognized that some of the supposed spirits were still among the living. Mumler was eventually brought to trial for fraud in April 1869. Barnum himself testified against him, having hired Abraham Bodarges, another photographer, to create a picture that appeared to show Barnum with the ghost of Abraham Lincoln, to demonstrate the ease with which such spirit photography could be created. You can see both Mrs. Lincoln and P.T. Barnum's photographs, and I would have included myself as President Lincoln, but I was on a deadline and no time to Photoshop. So you can see these images on our website. In the end, Mumler was acquitted because the prosecution could not prove beyond all doubt that he was fabricating the photographs. But following the trial, his career never fully recovered. A review of Peter Monceau's book, The Apparitionists, A Tale of Phantoms, Fraud, Photography, and the Man Who Captured Lincoln's Ghost, asks, what do you do when a desire to believe overwhelms common sense and a preponderance of evidence? Well, good question. Monceau professes that in a time of death and horrible losses in the Civil War, people turned to photography hoping to be united with deceased loved ones in perpetuity. He further explains, no sooner had people invented a way of creating photographic images, whether it was a daguerreotype, an ambrotype, or a halotype, then people found ways of altering the images, and, even more relevantly, of lying about their contents and how they were obtained. A photograph, as we all know, can't talk back. There we are, Marianne, the social media of its time.
Mm-hmm.
Please stay tuned for the continuing saga of Everyone Dies, and thank you for listening. This is Charlie Navarrete. Stephen Sondheim wrote a song called Every Day a Little Death. This is from A Little Night Music. The husbands of two women are having affairs. Each still loves her adulterous husband, and each day they explain, in the lips and in the eyes, in the gestures, in the sighs, every day a little sting, every day a little dies. Sleep well, Mr. Sondheim.
And I'm Marianne Matzo. And remember, every day is a gift.
Processing into a powder and mixing it, rendered with poo.
On this podcast, such as
No poo.
No poo.
I will not eat it if it has poo in it.
I will not eat this if it's poo. I will not eat stew-doo. Okay, something like that. I would not eat it, Sam, would you? I would not eat it if it's poo. I would not eat it, Sam, would you? There we are.
Yeah, you're 65.
Yep.
If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor or 911 immediately. Everyone Dies does not recommend or endorse any specific tests, practitioners, products, procedures, opinions, or other information that may be mentioned in this podcast. Reliance on any information provided in this podcast by persons appearing on this podcast at the invitation of Everyone Dies or by other members is solely at your own risk.